I was not sentenced in a hall of judgment or beneath a banner of justice. There was no crowd, no reading of crimes, no chance to speak. My reassignment arrived folded once, stamped twice, and pressed into my palm by a clerk who did not look at my face long enough to remember it. The parchment smelled of ink and ash, and where my name should have been there was only a labor designation. Letters and numbers arranged with the cold efficiency of a coffin plate. Report to lower manufactorum. The clerk said, already reaching for the next file. His voice was dry, tired, practiced. I could have been anyone. I was anyone. I remember thinking I had been spared. Ammunition loading, the order said. Not the front, not the mines, not the recycling vats where men disappeared screaming into steam. I told myself this was a mercy, a quiet corner of the war where hands did work and bodies stayed mostly intact. I told myself many lies in the seconds it took to sign my acknowledgement. They marched us down in groups of 20, chains linking our wrists not for security but for efficiency. The descent never seemed to end. The hive above us groaned with distant traffic and gunfire, but each level we passed stripped more of that noise away, replacing it with the deeper sounds of industry, grinding gears, hammering pistons, the endless thunder of machines too large to see whole. By the time we reached the lower manufactorum, the air had changed completely. It was thick and hot, heavy with the taste of propellant dust that coated my tongue the moment I inhaled. Hot oil hung in the air like a fog, stinging my eyes and clinging to my skin. Every surface sweated grime. The floor vibrated constantly, a low tremor that traveled up through my boots and into my bones. The line was already running when we arrived. It stretched farther than I could see in either direction, a river of metal flowing at a pace that made my stomach tighten. Conveyor belts rattled and clanked, carrying empty casings toward us and full shells away, disappearing into chutes that led God knows where. Overhead, pistons slammed down in brutal rhythm, their timing precise enough to kill without hesitation. An overseer waited for us at the edge of the line. His robes were blackened with grease, his augmetic eye clicking softly as it focused on each of us in turn. He carried a data slate in one hand and a shock baton in the other, not threateningly, not theatrically, just present, like another tool of the line. You have been assigned to munitions throughput, he said. Your labor designation will be called when required. You will respond immediately. No one spoke. The machines were too loud anyway. He raised the data slate and began to read. Not our names, never our names, procedures, penalties, expected output, injury classifications. Death was listed under acceptable attrition, subdivided into categories based on how much downtime it caused. Then he reached the part that mattered. Shift length, he said, voice amplified over the roar, as 18 hours. Mandatory. The words hit harder than any blow. 18 hours. I felt it settle into my chest, heavy and immovable. I tried to imagine 18 hours of anything, sleep, marching, standing guard, and my mind balked. But the belts did not slow, the pistons did not pause. The line did not care about my imagination. You will be injected with stimulants at scheduled intervals. The overseer continued. Unauthorized rest will be logged as sabotage. Sabotage will be punished. He did not specify how. He did not need to. We were unchained and assigned positions along the line. My station was a narrow gap between two pistons, barely wide enough for my shoulders. A metal bin sat to my left, filled with empty shell casings, each one nearly the length of my forearm and heavy enough to bruise if dropped. To my right, a cradle waited, metal jaws opening and closing in time with the belt. Feed the casing when the light turns green, the overseer said, pointing to a lumen strip above my station. Withdraw your hands before the piston descends, he demonstrated once, smooth, precise. Then he stepped back. The light turned green. I hesitated. The casing slipped in my sweaty grip, clanging loudly as it hit the cradle. The piston slammed down a heartbeat later, missing my fingers by a margin so thin I felt the displaced air brush my skin. My heart lurched violently. The overseer's augmetic eye whirred. Do not hesitate, he said calmly. Hesitation increases error probability. I nodded. Though he was already turning away, the rhythm asserted itself quickly. Green light, lift casing, slot casing, withdraw hands, slam, red light, repeat. The machine did not wait for understanding. It demanded obedience measured in fractions of a second. My arms began to ache within minutes, muscles burning as I lifted and placed and withdrew, over and over again. The noise was constant and absolute, metal on metal, pistons slamming like artillery, warning klaxons barking somewhere down the line, never stopping, just overlapping in layers until they became part of the background. Shouted prayers echoed from loudspeakers, safety litanies recited in a monotone cadence that did nothing to slow the pace. Blessed is the calibrated hand, the speakers intoned. Cursed is the delayed response. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. Propellant dust mixed with it, forming a gritty paste that stuck to my skin. My lungs burned with every breath. I tried not to think about where the air came from, or how long it had been circulating through this place. After the first hour, my thoughts began to narrow. There was no room for memory here. No space for fear, not really, only timing, motion, the precise moment when the light changed. I stopped thinking in sentences and started thinking in beats. Lift, place, pull, slam. Mistakes happened around me. A man to my left misjudged the timing and lost 2 fingers. The machine did not stop. Blood sprayed across the belt, streaking the casings red. An alarm chimed not in warning but in acknowledgement. A servitor arrived moments later, dragging the screaming man away by the collar as if removing debris. The overseer logged it without comment. We kept loading. I began to understand then that safety was not the point. Speed was throughput. The line existed to produce ammunition in numbers vast enough to justify the cost of bodies fed into it. We were not protected from the machine. We were offered to it. As the hours crawled on, the fear I had carried down here did not fade. It transformed. It became something steadier, heavier. A knowledge that this was not a temporary suffering, not a trial to be endured for reward later. This was the shape of my life now, defined by belts and lights and pistons. When the first stimulant injection came, a servo arm jabbed the needle into my neck without warning. Fire raced through my veins. My heart leapt into a frantic rhythm, my hands trembling violently even as they moved faster. The world sharpened painfully, every sound too loud, every light too bright. Productivity increased. The overseer noted. I wanted to scream. Instead, I loaded shells. 18 hours, I told myself. Just 18 hours. The belts never stopped moving, and neither did my fear. The machine taught me faster than any drill sergeant ever did, because the machine's lessons were written in crushed bone and torn skin. There is a rhythm to munitions work that you cannot understand until it owns you. Not music. Music has mercy. It rises and falls. It gives you a breath before the next beat. This rhythm was a hammer. It was the same impact again and again, the same interval, the same unforgiving timing that turned human hesitation into waste. Green lift, slot, withdraw, slam. The lumen strip above my station became my sun, my God, my judge. Its light changed without emotion, and my hands obeyed or paid. I watched it so hard my eyes ached. When I blinked, I felt guilty, as if I had committed a sin by losing sight of the one thing that mattered. I began to blink only on red, forcing my eyelids to obey a schedule the machine would accept. My palms grew slick with sweat and propellant dust, and the casings grew harder to grip. They were cold at first, drawn from bins that fed us like open mouths. But after hours on the line they warmed, absorbing the heat of the manufacturum and the heat of our bodies. The brass had a smell when warmed, sharp, acrid, metallic. It clung to my fingers even when I rubbed them against my uniform. The conveyor belt rattled constantly beneath my station, its surface scarred by years of friction and spilled lubricant. The belt's motion was hypnotic if you let it be. A steady flow of metal bodies, empty shells rolling toward me with a kind of eager inevitability. I learned to read their approach, by sound as much as sight. The scrape as a casing bumped a weld seam, the clinkers too kissed and separated, the faint hiss as a lubricated section passed under the rollers. Above and around us, the manufactorum roared. Not one sound but a cathedral of noise, pistons slamming, gears whining, chains clattering, klaxons calling out errors and accidents like bells tolling. Every few minutes, a loudspeaker crackled to life, broadcasting safety litanies in a voice stripped of warmth. Blessed is the hand that withdraws in time. It droned. Cursed is the flesh that delays the mechanism. It was not comfort. It was warning. It was blame prepared in advance. The overseer lights swept for errors. They weren't lights in the simple sense, more like scanning beams that passed over our stations in slow arcs, bathing us in harsh white and then red. When they touched my hands, my skin crawled. I could feel my heart beat in my fingertips, as if the machine could see my fear and log it. Sometimes, if a worker's timing slipped, the scanning light would pause and flash a specific pattern. A servo's skull would drift down, its lens clicking as it recorded the infraction. Not to correct, not to assist, only to remember. I began to understand that mistakes here were not fixed. They were archived. At the end of the first work block, a servitor rolled down the line on a track embedded in the floor. It carried a rack of data, slates, and a mechanical arm that extended toward each station. When it reached me, it pressed a slate into my hands. OUPUTT, a number so high it felt obscene. Hiorit OUPU lower than target by a fraction. DV on Reski moderate. Under that, a space for acknowledgement. My labor designation was already printed there. I signed with a trembling finger. The servitor took the slate away and moved on, its jaw slack, its eyes replaced with dull sensors. The line never slowed during the transaction. The piston continued to slam down, the green light continued to blink, and I had to resume loading before my next breath. My thoughts began to flatten exactly as the outline promised, though at the time I didn't have language for it. It was like watching my own mind be pressed between rollers, smoothed out until it could no longer catch on anything sharp. Memories of the hive above, its dirty rain, its crowded corridors, the smell of cheap rickaf, lost color, faces blurred. Even my own fear became less distinct, more like a constant pressure rather than a sharp sensation. There was only the casing, the cradle, the light. When I tried to think about the larger purpose, where the shells went, what they would be fired into, whose bodies they would tear apart, my brain slid away from the thought as if it were coated in oil. The manufacturum did not permit philosophy. It demanded motion, green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam. My hands developed their own instincts. They began to move before I consciously decided to move them. I watched myself work with a strange detachment, as if I were observing another person from behind my own eyes. When the light turned green, my arm lifted. When the cradle opened, my fingers released. When the piston descended, my hand snapped back. I wondered briefly if this was what servitors felt like, if they felt anything at all, and the thought made bile rise in my throat. A worker 2 stations down coughed constantly, a wet, rattling sound that cut through even the roar. He was young, his cheeks hollowed by hunger and dust. Each cough sprayed flecks of blood onto his station, bright red against brass. He did not slow. He could not. The machine would not allow it. An overseer noticed the blood. He walked over, baton in hand, and watched for exactly 3 cycles: green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam, red. Again. The worker coughed again, shaking so hard his timing slipped by a fraction. The piston caught his fingertip, crushing it flat with a sound like a fruit bursting. He screamed, high and raw. The overseer did not react to the scream. He tapped his data slate. Deviation recorded, he said calmly. Medical deficiency noted. A servitor arrived and dragged the worker away. Another worker was pushed into the gap before the belt had carried 3 casings past. The rhythm did not change. I learned then that the line did not punish mistakes out of cruelty. Cruelty implies attention, intent. The line punished mistakes because mistakes threatened efficiency, and efficiency was holy. A few hours later, though hours had begun to feel like an abstract concept, my own mistake came. My fingers slipped on a casing slick with oil. It rolled off the cradle's edge, clattering loudly onto the floor. For a heartbeat, the cradle was empty on green. The piston slammed down anyway, striking bare metal and sparking bright. The sound was different, wrong, angry. A warning rune flashed on my station's panel. The scanning light snapped to me. I froze, heart pounding, waiting for a baton strike, for a shout, for a servitor's cold hand at my collar. Instead, the cogitator at the end of the line printed an infraction strip. A servo skull floated down and pressed it against my chest like a condemning finger. EROR to YPE. Feed failure dubodlike mesadiziu seconds. ACT unshu record. No correction, no training, just record. My hands resumed their motion automatically. I wanted to cry with relief, but relief was wasted time. The noise became a substance, something I breathed and swallowed. The klaxons barked constantly, but after a while they blurred into the same monotonous howl. My ears rang. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. When I tried to swallow, my throat felt raw, scraped by dust. At the next scheduled stimulant injection, the servo arm jabbed my neck again. This time my body reacted with nausea. My heart raced too fast, and for a moment the lumen strip seemed to stutter, the green and red smearing into one another. Panic flared. If I couldn't see the light, I couldn't time the cycle. I forced my eyes open wider, tears streaming from the corners. The world sharpened again. The rhythm remained. My hands obeyed. Green, slot, withdraw, slam. Somewhere down the line, a prayer began, a low chant taken up by exhausted throats. It wasn't a hymn of hope. It was a counting mechanism, a way to mark cycles when time had become meaningless. 1, they murmured with each green. 2, 3. I did not join in at first. It felt childish, futile. Then, without realizing it, I started counting too. Not aloud, not with words, but with a beat inside my skull. Counting casings, counting cycles, counting anything that could keep my mind tethered to something besides the endless present. Mistakes were recorded. Bodies were removed. The line continued. And somewhere in that unbroken rhythm, I felt my humanity thinning, stretched over the mechanism like a membrane until only motion remained. The first man collapsed 6 casings into my count. I know that because I was counting then, quietly, desperately, each shell a marker driven into the formless mass of time. 1, 2, 3, green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam, a 5, 6. On the 7th cycle after a stimulant injection, the man 2 stations to my right simply stopped moving. There was no warning, no dramatic cry. His hands slowed, missed the green by a fraction, and then did not rise again. His knees buckled as if someone had cut a cable inside him, and he folded forward, forehead striking the edge of his station with a dull, meaty sound. His body slid down and came to rest half in, half out of the conveyor's path. The line did not slow. A casing rolled forward and struck his shoulder. Another bumped into his head. The belt began to drag him, cloth tearing as his weight resisted. I stared for half a heartbeat too long and nearly missed my own cycle. The piston slammed down, close enough that I felt the vibration through my wrists. An alarm chimed, not the shrill klaxon of catastrophe, but a soft, almost polite tone. A notice, PIVUINTREDVED. The overseer arrived within seconds. He did not rush. He did not swear. He looked down at the collapsed man with the same expression one might give a jammed component. Annoyance, calculation, nothing more. Vettels. He asked no one in particular. A servo skull drifted in, scanned the body with a thin beam of light, and clicked. Minimal. It reported in a flat, genderless voice. The overseer nodded. Remove. 2 servitors arrived from opposite sides of the line. They did not bother to lift him carefully. One took an arm, the other took a leg. They dragged him backward, his boots leaving dark streaks on the floor where oil and blood mixed into a slick sheen. The belt kept moving. Another worker, shorter, thinner, eyes already glazed with fatigue, was pushed into the gap before the collapsed man's station had even cooled. His hands were shoved toward the bin of casings. The lumen strip flashed green. He hesitated. The overseer's baton cracked across his shoulder, sharp and precise. Work, the overseer said. The man worked. I kept loading. Something inside me screamed that this was wrong, that a human life had just ended, or was ending, less than an arm's length away, and the world had not even paused to acknowledge it. But the scream had nowhere to go. There was no space for it between cycles, no time to grieve when the machine demanded my hands. Green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam. Blood spread across the floor in a widening smear. It mixed with lubricant and propellant dust, forming a slick paste that caught the light in ugly, iridescent patterns. Workers slipped more often after that. A stumble here, a near miss there. Each incident logged. Each one treated as an isolated inefficiency, not a symptom. I began to understand the truth then, slowly, reluctantly. We were not workers. We were buffer stock. Our bodies existed to absorb errors so the machine would not have to. When a casing missed, a finger was crushed instead of a piston damaged. When exhaustion caused a slip, a man fell into the belt rather than forcing a shutdown. Flesh was cheaper than steel. Bones were more replaceable than gears. The realization settled over me like lead. Another man went down an hour later, this one screaming, clutching his chest as his heart rebelled against the stimulants pumping through his veins. He convulsed on the floor, froth bubbling at his lips. The line dragged his legs until a servitor intervened, pinning him with mechanical efficiency, while the belt continued to feed casings past his head. I stepped over him when the belt carried a casing too close to my station, and I had to adjust my footing. My boot slid slightly on the blood-slick floor. I corrected without thinking, my hands never missing a cycle. That was the moment I knew something fundamental had changed in me. I did not feel shock. I did not feel horror. I felt irritation, fear that the disruption might affect my timing, that the slipping floor might increase my own error probability. I hated myself for that thought even as it formed, but hating myself required time, and time was a luxury the line did not grant. The overseer's data, Slate chimed again, attrition within acceptable range. He said aloud, as if reciting a blessing, acceptable. The word echoed in my head. The floor grew more dangerous as the hours dragged on. Blood, oil, coolant, and sweat formed an ever-changing map of hazards. We adjusted instinctively, widening our stance, shifting weight, compensating without instruction. The line taught us how to survive just enough to keep working. I started counting bodies instead of hours. 1 collapsed, 2 dragged away, 3 replaced, 4 bled out somewhere behind the line, out of sight but not out of the machine's awareness. 5 screamed until a baton silenced him. 6 stopped moving quietly, mercifully, each one marked not by ceremony but by a line in a report. PRDUSTVINTR resolved. The smell changed as the shift wore on. It thickened, sweet and coppery beneath the ever-present oil and dust. It clung to the back of my throat, made me gag when I tried to swallow. The air recyclers whined louder, struggling to keep up, but they were never meant to make this place clean, only breathable. A worker near the end of the visible line slipped fully into the conveyor. His leg vanished beneath the rollers with a crunch I felt in my teeth. He screamed, high and piercing, until the sound cut off abruptly. The belt slowed for exactly 3 seconds while a servitor disengaged his remains. 3 seconds. The overseer frowned. Excessive downtime, he muttered, and made a note. I loaded shells during those 3 seconds too, my hands moving out of pure reflex even as the machine stuttered. When the belt resumed its full speed, I barely noticed the difference. My arms ached constantly now, a deep, gnawing pain that radiated from shoulder to wrist. My fingers felt swollen, clumsy, numb at the tips. Every casing felt heavier than the last, as if the metal were absorbing the weight of everything I had seen. I began to imagine the shells as coffins, each one sealed and sent away, carrying with it a fragment of this place, blood in the grooves, sweat in the seams, the echo of screaming metal. I wondered, distantly, who would die when these were fired? Soldiers, civilians. People who would never know that the ammunition that ended them had been loaded over the bodies of forgotten laborers. The thought did not slow my hands. It only hollowed me further. At some point, I could not say when, I stopped looking down the line. I kept my eyes fixed on my station, my light, my cradle. Peripheral vision became dangerous. Seeing too much risked hesitation, and hesitation meant injury. The chant of counting grew louder, spreading station to station. A low murmur threaded through the roar of machinery. It was not synchronized. Everyone counted at their own pace, clinging to numbers as if they were lifelines. I counted shells, I counted bodies, I counted mistakes. I did not count hours anymore. Hours had no mercy. When another man collapsed beside me, this one simply slumping against the machine, his head lolling as his heart finally gave out, I felt nothing at all. No fear, no pity, just the mild annoyance of adjusting my stance again to avoid slipping. The servitors came, the line continued, and I understood, with a clarity that chilled me more than exhaustion ever could, that I was not meant to survive this place as a person. I was meant to survive it as a function. Fatigue was not a failure state. That was the first thing the manufacturer taught me once the bodies began to pile up with regularity. Exhaustion was not an emergency, not a warning sign, not a condition to be treated in the human sense. It was a variable, measured, anticipated, regulated. The machine did not fear tired workers. It planned for them. The first fatigue injection came without ceremony. A servo arm descended from the overhead track while my hands were still moving, green light blinking insistently above my station. I felt the needle bite into the side of my neck, sharp and cold, followed by a burning surge that flooded my veins like liquid fire. My heart slammed against my ribs hard enough to steal my breath. For a moment the world narrowed to a pinprick of light, my vision tunneling so tightly I thought I might black out. The machine did not care. My hands sped up. Muscles that had been screaming moments before fell silent, replaced by a jittery, unnatural strength. My fingers twitched constantly, spasms rippling through them like faulty wiring. Sweat poured off me in sheets, soaking my uniform until it clung to my skin like a second hide. My thoughts scattered, racing ahead of themselves, then snapping back violently to the present when the light turned green. Lift, slot, withdraw, slam. The overseer watched the injection with professional detachment. He checked his data slate, nodded once, and moved on. To him, I was not a man receiving drugs to keep him upright. I was a system being recalibrated. The stimulants came at regular intervals after that, timed to projected productivity decline. Each one felt worse than the last. My heart raced constantly now, even between injections, fluttering unpredictably in my chest like a trapped animal. My hands shook so badly that gripping the casings required conscious effort, my fingers locking and unlocking with mechanical stubbornness. Pain changed character. It did not disappear, despite the drugs. Instead, it flattened, spread out, lost its urgency. The ache in my arms, the burning in my shoulders, the stabbing soreness in my lower back, all of it blended into a single, constant presence. Pain became background noise, like the roar of the machines, noticeable only when it briefly spiked, then swallowed again by necessity. I learned quickly that reacting to pain was dangerous. A worker near me cried out when a casing slipped and grazed his wrist, tearing skin. The moment his voice rose above the din, an overseer turned, "Maintain focus." The overseer said, "Baton already in hand." The baton struck the worker's ribs, not hard enough to break them, just enough to punish the lapse. The man gasped, his timing faltered, and the piston crushed his thumb completely. The incident report listed it as compound inefficiency. The safety litanies grew more frequent as the shift dragged on, blared from speakers mounted high above the line. "Blessed is the body that endures," they intoned. "Blessed is the worker who does not sleep." The words were meaningless, but their cadence wormed into my skull. I found myself mouthing them silently as I worked, sensing my breathing to their rhythm, using them to anchor myself when my vision swam and my balance threatened to fail. Sleep became a fantasy, not rest, not lying down, not closing my eyes, but the idea of stopping, of stillness, of not having to respond to the light. The thought drifted into my mind unbidden, tempting and terrifying. Each time it surfaced, I shoved it away violently, afraid that even entertaining it would slow my hands. I caught myself daydreaming once, just once. The light turned green, and for a fraction of a second I imagined myself somewhere else, a narrow hab room with flickering lumen strips, a cup of thin recaf warming my hands, silence broken only by distant hive traffic. The image was so vivid it hurt. My hand hesitated. The piston slammed down a heartbeat later, clipping the edge of my glove and tearing fabric. The shock snapped me back to reality with a jolt of pure terror. My heart hammered wildly, the stimulant-fueled rhythm threatening to tear itself apart. The scanning light locked onto me. A servo skull descended, its lens clicking as it recorded the infraction. ERR2IP cognitive drift, SEVERARA minor, CARRO and none. The machine had no interest in correcting my mind. It only cared that my body continued to function. From then on, I stopped letting my thoughts wander. I reduced them to the smallest possible shape, counting, timing, motion. Anything larger risked breaking through the thin shell of control I had left. The fatigue protocols escalated as the hours crawled by. Injections came closer together. The drugs changed composition, stronger stimulants mixed with pain suppressants and focus enhancers. Each dose left a bitter taste in my mouth, my tongue going numb, my jaw clenching uncontrollably. My vision pulsed in time with my heartbeat, the edges of the world shimmering and distorting. Some workers began to hallucinate. One man laughed hysterically at nothing, tears streaming down his face as his hands continued to load shells with perfect timing. Another whispered prayers non-stop, his lips bleeding where he had bitten them raw. A woman further down the line screamed that the casings were breathing, that they were warm and alive. The overseers took note. They did not stop the line. Workers who became too erratic were marked and removed during moments of minimal disruption, replaced seamlessly. Their absence was felt only as a slight change in airflow, a brief flicker of movement in the periphery. I began to envy them, not because they escaped, but because they were done. My own body refused to fail properly. The stimulants kept me upright, my muscles obedient even as my mind frayed. My heart felt like it might burst at any moment, but it did not. My legs trembled constantly, but they held. The machine was very good at keeping me alive. At some point, I cannot say when, the concept of pain lost all meaning. My hands were raw, skin cracked and bleeding where the brass rubbed again and again. Each casing scraped exposed flesh, leaving thin red streaks that darkened and flaked. I felt it distantly, as one might feel pressure through thick gloves. The safety litany changed tone near the end of the block, growing slower, more solemn. Rest is inefficiency. The speakers droned. Sleep is theft from duty. The words felt personal, accusatory. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and burning, and forced my hands to keep moving. Green. Lift, slot, withdraw, slam. I began to lose track of my own breathing. Sometimes I realized I had been holding my breath for several cycles, lungs screaming for air. Other times I gasped uncontrollably, hyperventilating until black spots danced in my vision. The drugs twisted my body's signals into nonsense, and I had to consciously regulate something as simple as inhaling. My heart rate spiked suddenly, painfully. A sharp pressure bloomed in my chest, radiating outward. For a terrifying moment, I thought this was it, that my body had finally reached its limit. A servo skull drifted closer, sensors whirring, cardiac stress within acceptable parameters. It announced, acceptable. The word followed me, echoed in my skull, a mockery of mercy. By the time the next injection came, my veins were so inflamed the needle struggled to find purchase. I hissed as it pierced deeper, pain flaring briefly before being swallowed by chemicals. My hands did not stop. I realized then that sleep was not forbidden because it was dangerous. It was forbidden because it was human, and humanity had no place on the line. The misfeed happened so fast that no one screamed until it was already over. I was counting again by then, not shells, not bodies, but breaths. In, out, in, out. It was the only way I could keep my chest from tearing itself apart under the stimulants. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel fixed on the cradle and the light above it. Everything else existed only as vibration and noise. Green, lift, slot, the casing jammed. It did not slide cleanly into the cradle. It caught at an angle. Brass scraping metal with a shriek that cut through the manufacturer's raw like a blade through cloth. For a fraction of a second, no more than that, the machine hesitated, then it reacted. The piston came down anyway. There was an explosion of sound and force so violent it felt like the world itself had been struck. The casing ruptured under pressure, not detonating cleanly but tearing itself apart in a spray of shrapnel and fire. The blast knocked me backward, my feet skidding out from under me on the blood-slick floor. Heat washed over my face, searing my eyebrows, blistering exposed skin. The line screamed, not the workers, the machine. Alarms howled in layered tones, warning runes flashing red across panels and overhead displays. Smoke poured from the misfeed point, thick and acrid, burning my lungs the moment I inhaled. Metal fragments clattered across the floor, embedding themselves in flesh and steel alike. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from my chest. For a moment I lay there stunned, ears ringing, vision filled with sparks. Then the pain arrived, a hot, tearing sensation ripped through my left arm. I looked down and saw blood pumping from a gash where a shard of casing had sliced through muscle. Another fragment had buried itself in the thigh of the worker across from me. He was screaming now, high and desperate, clutching at his leg as blood soaked his uniform. The belt did not stop. The explosion had not been enough to justify a full shutdown. The pistons nearest the blast slowed for less than a second before resuming their brutal rhythm. Casings continued to roll forward, clinking against one another, some dented, some scorched. Remain at stations. An overseer barked over the din, his voice amplified and distorted. Misfeed localized. Throughput priority. Throughput priority. I struggled to my knees, dizziness washing over me in waves. My left arm burned fiercely, my fingers slick with blood. Every instinct screamed at me to pull back, to cradle the wound, to protect myself. The light turned green. My right hand moved on its own. Lift, slot, withdraw, slam. I did not remember standing back up. I only knew that suddenly I was there again, swaying at my station. My wounded arm held awkwardly against my side, while my other hand continued to feed the machine. Blood dripped onto the floor, splashing into the already filthy slurry beneath my boots. The worker with the thigh wound collapsed, his scream cutting off into a gurgle as he fell. The belt dragged him a short distance before a servitor intervened, hauling him clear with mechanical indifference. A dark smear marked where his body had been. Smoke hung thick in the air, making my eyes water and my throat seize. Breathing became agony. Each inhale brought fire into my lungs. The alarms cut out abruptly, replaced by a Connor ND and Contain ND FIC Liesa AC Siptabili. Servitors swarmed the blast site, scraping away twisted metal and gore, spraying suppressant foam that hissed and steamed on contact. Overseers moved along the line, shouting orders, striking workers who slowed or froze. Their batons cracked against flesh, sharp reports that barely registered against the background noise. I felt hands on me, strong, impersonal, yanking my wounded arm out to inspect it. An overseer glanced at the gash, blood still flowing freely. "None fatal," he said. A servo arm descended, jabbing a needle directly into the wound. Pain flared blindingly, then dulled as coagulants and stimulants flooded my system. The bleeding slowed, the edges of the cut knitting together roughly, painfully. No bandage, no rest. The light blinked green again. Green, lift slot, withdraw slam. The line worked through the aftermath as if nothing had happened. Smoke gradually thinned. The smell of burned flesh and scorched metal lingered, clinging to everything. The floor was slicker than ever, treacherous with new layers of blood and foam. I stepped over fragments of casing embedded in the ground, adjusting my stance to compensate for the uneven surface. My arm throbbed dully, the pain suppressed but not gone. I could feel warmth running down my side, where blood still leaked through hastily sealed skin. Somewhere down the line, someone began to sob. It did not stop the machine. The incident report printed at my station moments later, sliding out of the cogitator with a soft mechanical sigh. INCENTYP mechanical misfeed, CCUES4 confirmed, INGRIST 11 recorded, TRUHP IMPA seat 7%, ICORA AVFTO, none required, 4 confirmed. I knew at least one of those men had been alive when the servitors dragged him away. I wondered briefly if, confirmed, meant dead now, or merely accounted for. The thought broke something inside me, not dramatically, not all at once. It was quieter than that, a subtle cracking, like stress fractures spreading through bone. A realization that this place was not merely indifferent to suffering. It was structured around it. Suffering was not a byproduct. It was a tool. I felt hollow. The stimulants could not touch that emptiness. They kept my body moving, my heart racing, my hands obedient, but they could not fill the space where something essential had been torn away. As the hours crawled on after the misfeed, the line seemed even louder, even more oppressive. Every slam of the piston echoed the blast in my memory. Every screech of metal made me flinch internally. Though my body no longer reacted outwardly, I began to fear the sound of silence. Because silence meant something worse than a misfeed. It meant a failure large enough to matter. It meant attention from higher up the chain. It meant consequences that would not be measured in percentages. The machine preferred us broken but functional. By the time the smoke fully cleared, I was no longer shaking. That frightened me more than the explosion. I loaded shell after shell with bloodied hands, stepping over scorch marks and dark stains, my mind locked into the rhythm, because anything else was unbearable. I did not think about the men who had died. I did not think about the shells I was loading. I thought only about the next green light. Something inside me had snapped during the misfeed, some last illusion that endurance might earn reprieve, that suffering had a limit beyond which the system would relent. There was no such limit. There was only output. By the time the manufacturum clocks crawled toward the 18th hour, my body was no longer entirely mine. I say toward, because I could not see the clocks from my station, only feel their approach in the way my muscles failed in new and inventive patterns. Time announced itself through symptoms now, not numbers, a tremor in my hands that would not stop, a strange hollowness behind my eyes, as if my skull had been scooped clean and filled with static, a sense that my limbs were a fraction of a second out of sync with my thoughts, like damaged servos lagging behind command input. The line had not changed. It never did. The belts moved at the same speed. The pistons slammed with the same merciless regularity. The lumen strip blinked green and red with unwavering discipline. If the clock said 18 hours had passed, it was not because the machine slowed to acknowledge it. It was because my body had reached a point where it could no longer pretend otherwise. My hands moved without permission now. That realization came to me slowly, like the onset of hypothermia. At first I thought I was simply focused, deeply entrenched in the rhythm. Then I noticed moments, terrifying moments, where my mind drifted entirely, where I became aware of my surroundings in a distant, unfocused way, and yet my hands continued to lift, slot, withdraw, slam with perfect timing. Green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam. I watched my fingers from somewhere behind my own eyes, cracked nails blackened with grime, knuckles swollen and split. They twitched constantly, tiny involuntary movements that never quite stopped. Even when the light was red, my muscles flexed in anticipation, eager to continue. I wondered dimly if this was what death felt like when it came in stages. The stimulants were failing, or perhaps they were working too well. My heart beat at a frantic, irregular pace that made my chest ache with every breath. Each inhale felt shallow, insufficient, as if my lungs had lost capacity. My vision pulsed in time with my heartbeat, the world contracting and expanding in nauseating waves. Sweat soaked me completely, pooling in my boots, trickling down my spine. It carried with it the sour stench of chemicals and fear. The heat of the manufacturum pressed in from all sides, magnified by the machines, by the bodies packed shoulder to shoulder along the line. I could no longer tell if my eyes were open or shut. This terrified me at first. The light mattered. The light was everything. But even as panic flared, my hands kept moving, obeying cues my conscious mind could no longer clearly perceive. Somewhere deeper, something had learned the pattern well enough to continue without supervision. That something was not me. The shells felt heavier. I know that is not possible. Metal does not gain mass because a man is tired. But each casing seemed to carry a weight beyond its physical measure, a pressure that sank into my palms and traveled up my arms into my shoulders. Lifting them became an act of will that left my muscles screaming. I began to imagine that weight was not metal, but consequence. Each shell would be fired. That was their purpose. Each one would tear through flesh, shatter bone, explode inside bodies that had never known this place. I did not see faces. I did not imagine details. The thought was simpler and more crushing than that. These shells would work. They would do what they were made to do with brutal efficiency. And my role, my entire existence at that moment, was to ensure they did so without delay. The idea hollowed me out further. A man near the end of the visible line slumped forward, his forehead resting against his station. He did not fall. His hands kept moving, guided by muscle memory alone, his head bobbing slightly with each piston slam. He was still loading. An overseer noticed and approached, baton raised. He struck the man sharply across the back of the neck. The man jerked upright with a strangled gasp, eyes wide and unfocused. "Remain conscious," the overseer said calmly. "Unconscious labor is inefficient." The man nodded weakly and resumed his work, tears streaming down his face. I felt nothing. That scared me more than the misfeed, more than the bodies dragged away, more than the injections that made my heart feel like it might burst. I watched cruelty unfold inches from me and felt only a dull, distant awareness. Like reading about an atrocity in a poorly printed pamphlet, my emotions had been flattened completely. The counting in my head broke down around then. Numbers slipped away from me, refusing to hold shape. I tried to count shells and lost track within seconds. I tried to count breaths and forgot whether I had just inhaled or exhaled. I gave up counting. The world narrowed further. collapsing inward until only the station existed, the bin, the cradle, the light. Everything else became noise, vibration, heat. I could no longer feel my feet. They were still there. I could see them when my vision briefly steadied, but sensation had retreated upward, leaving my legs numb and unresponsive. I adjusted my stance without realizing it, compensating for balance issues I could no longer consciously perceive. The machine was keeping me upright. I began to understand then, with a clarity that cut through the haze, that survival was not the objective. Throughput was. As long as my body could be made to perform the necessary motions, it would be used. When it could not, it would be removed and replaced. Whether I lived or died mattered only insofar as it affected the flow of ammunition. This was not cruelty born of malice, it was efficiency perfected. The thought did not anger me, it did not sadden me. It simply settled, becoming another accepted truth layered atop all the others. A klaxon sounded somewhere distant, different from the others. Deeper. Slower. It took me a moment to realize what it signified, the end of the shift, 18 hours. The knowledge reached me in fragments. My hands continued to move for several cycles after the klaxon began, obeying habit rather than command. When the belt finally slowed, not stopped, it felt wrong, like the world stuttering. The pistons did not halt completely. They idled, slamming down at longer intervals, as if reluctant to relinquish their work. My arms sagged the moment the light went dark for the first time since I arrived. The sudden absence of demand felt like a physical blow. My knees buckled, and I would have fallen if the worker beside me had not collapsed at the same moment, our bodies colliding and keeping one another upright in a grotesque parody of support. For a heartbeat, a single, fragile heartbeat, I thought it was over. Then the cogitator at the end of the line printed. I did not see the data slate yet. I only heard it slide out with a soft, final sound that cut through the fading roar of machinery. The line had not stopped, it had only paused, and something in me, buried deep beneath exhaustion and chemicals and fear, already knew what that meant. The klaxon's echo was still vibrating in my skull when the data slate reached my station. It slid out of the cogitator with a soft, obscene gentleness, as if the machine knew exactly how tired I was and wished to savor the moment. I stared at it for a long second, my eyes struggling to focus on the blocky letters swimming across its surface. My hands hung uselessly at my sides, fingers curled and twitching, still expecting the green light that never came. Around me, bodies sagged. Some workers slumped against their stations, breathing in ragged gasps. Others collapsed outright, folding to the floor where they stood, their limbs refusing to hold them any longer. A few stared blankly ahead, eyes open and glassy, their hands still moving in small, repetitive motions as if the line was still there. Servitors drifted in to begin triage, not medical triage, but sorting. Viable, non-functional. I forced myself to pick up the slate. The words blurred, then sharpened. Resi GMNT not SCSCBCT labor designation, SDUS, EXTDDY, RVNPNDNG, EFITIVM. That was all. No commendation for surviving 18 hours. No acknowledgement of injuries. No rest authorization. Just an extension, cold and total, delivered with the same indifference as the original order. Extended duty. My mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. My throat felt raw, scraped hollow by dust and shouting and chemicals. When I did manage to speak, my voice sounded distant to my own ears, thin and wrong. "There's been a mistake," I said. The overseer nearest me turned slowly, his augmetic eye wearing as it focused. He looked at the slate in my hand, then at my face. His expression did not change. "Extended duty is not a mistake," he said. "It is an optimization. I've completed the shift." I insisted, though even as I said it the words felt meaningless. 18 hours. Mandatory. That was the order, and now the order is amended. He replied calmly. He tapped his data slate, scrolling through entries I could not see. "Your output remained within acceptable parameters despite injury and fatigue. Replacement would incur unnecessary efficiency loss." Unnecessary. The word struck harder than any baton. "My arm," I began, lifting it slightly. Pain flared where the misfeed shrapnel had torn through muscle, the crude seal already failing under sweat and motion. "Functional," the overseer said, glancing at briefly. Pain response suppressed. Mobility adequate. "I need rest." I said, the desperation creeping into my voice despite myself. I can't. He raised the baton just enough to silence me. Your statement is logged, he said. Classification vocal inefficiency. The words appeared on the slate in my hand even as he spoke them. Vocale inefficiency RD. Something inside me snapped then, not loudly, not cleanly. It was more like the final thread giving way under too much strain. I laughed, a hoarse, broken sound that scraped my throat raw. It felt hysterical even to me, but I couldn't stop. The overseer watched without reaction. Return to station, he said. The line began to move again. Not at full speed, not yet, but enough. The belts creaked back to life, casings clinking forward with patient inevitability. The pistons resumed their rhythm, slow at first, like a predator stretching after rest. The green light blinked on, my body reacted instantly. Before my mind could protest, before fear or anger could even take shape, my hands moved. Lift, slot, withdraw, slam. The motion tore a gasp from my chest, pain flaring brightly through my wounded arm. I nearly dropped the casing, barely correcting in time. The overseer nodded once, satisfied. That was the moment I understood there would be no end to this cycle. Not after 18 hours. Not after 36. Not after my body failed in ways that could be logged and compensated for. As long as I could be made to stand, to move, to feed the machine, I would be kept here. When I could not, I would be removed as waste and replaced before the metal cooled. I tried to protest again, though I do not remember deciding to do so. The words came out slurred, thick with exhaustion and chemical residue. This isn't what I was told, I said. There has to be a limit. The overseer leaned closer, close enough that I could smell the oil and incense clinging to his robes. There is a limit, he said quietly. You are not it. The stimulant injection came moments later, unannounced. The needle bit into my neck, flooding my system with another surge of artificial wakefulness. My heart lurched violently, pain exploding in my chest, but my limbs steadied, my vision sharpening cruelly. The machine had no intention of letting me collapse yet. I worked. The hours that followed blurred together into something worse than fatigue, continuation. There was no longer even the illusion of a defined shift. Time became an unbroken line, indistinguishable from the conveyor belt itself. Casings flowered. Pistons slammed. Bodies fell and were removed with practiced speed. I noticed fewer new faces now. Replacements came slower, as if the manufacturer had already allocated its surplus. The gaps left by collapsed workers were filled by stretching those of us who remained, widening our stations, increasing our reach, efficiency optimized. At some point, I realized I was no longer angry. Anger requires energy. Anger imagines alternatives. I had neither. What remained was a dull, grinding acceptance, heavy as the casings in my hands. This was my purpose now, not as a citizen, not as a soldier, not even as a laborer. As a process. I caught my reflection briefly in the polished brass of a casing, gaunt, eyes sunken and red, face streaked with grime and blood. I did not recognize it. It looked like something half-assembled, a prototype abandoned before completion. The thought barely registered before the next green light demanded my attention. Lift, slot, withdraw. Slam, the line welcomed me back without pause, and somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of exhaustion and numb obedience, a terrible certainty took root. The only way this would end was if my body failed completely. And even then, the work would continue. I no longer know how many shifts have passed since that first 18-hour sentence. The clocks still exist. I see them sometimes, high above the line, half obscured by steam and grime, their numerals flickering as power cycles stutter through ancient wiring. But they no longer belong to me. Time has been reduced to something mechanical, something external, like pressure or heat. It happens around me, not to me. I still stand at the line. That fact has become the only reliable truth I possess. My hands are no longer hands in any meaningful sense. They are scar tissue and swelling wrapped around bone. Fingers bent into permanent curves from gripping casings too long and too hard. Nails are gone, torn away or ground down to nothing. Skin splits and heals and splits again, never quite closing, always raw. I feel almost none of it anymore. Sensation has retreated inward, leaving behind a dull awareness of contact and force, nothing more. The machine does not require pain, only compliance. My arms have grown thin and corded, muscles hardened into something rope, like an unforgiving. My left arm, torn by shrapnel during the misfeed, never healed correctly. It aches constantly, a deep internal pressure that flares when I lift too fast or twist the wrong way. The overseers marked it as chronically functional and adjusted my station to compensate. Efficiency preserved. My mind is worse. Thoughts no longer arrive in complete shapes. They drift in fragments, images without context, words without meaning, memories stripped of emotion. I remember that I once had a name, but it feels like remembering a story told to me long ago, something that happened to someone else. My labor designation is easier. It has weight. It fits the space I have left inside myself. The line still moves. It always will. Casings arrive empty and leave full, sealed, stamped. Destined for wars I will never see. They clink and rattle and scrape past one another, indifferent to the blood smeared into their grooves, indifferent to the hands that feed them. I sometimes imagine that if I stopped, if I simply froze and let the belt carry on without me, the shells would find a way to load themselves. Perhaps they already have. I have seen men die here in every way a body can fail. Hearts that give out under stimulants, lungs that fill with blood and dust, spines snapped by pistons that do not forgive misalignment, minds that fracture quietly, leaving bodies that still move for a while out of habit alone. Each time the line adjusts, each time output continues, I have stopped counting bodies. There is no number that means anything anymore. They blur together into a single, continuous loss that the system absorbs without strain. The safety litanies still play, though the speakers crackle now, their voices warped and distorted by age. Blessed is the worker who endures. They murmur. Blessed is the flesh that feeds the war. I no longer mouth the words. I no longer need to. They are etched into me as deeply as the rhythm of the machine. Green, lift, slot, withdraw, slam. I sometimes wonder what happens when I finally fall. Not in a dramatic sense, no final scream, no defiant refusal. I imagine it will be quiet. My hands will slow just enough. My timing will slip by a fraction. The piston will descend where it should not. Or my heart will simply stop, exhausted beyond chemical correction. The overseers will note it. The servitors will come. My body will be dragged aside, logged, reduced to a line in a report. Downtime calculated, replacement sourced. The belt will keep moving. Another worker will take my place before the metal cools. That thought does not frighten me anymore. It comforts me. Because it means the machine does not need me to mean anything. I do not have to be remembered. I do not have to be forgiven. I do not have to understand why this exists or what purpose it serves beyond its own continuation. I only have to function until I cannot. Sometimes, rarely, I look at a finished shell as it disappears down the chute and feel a strange, hollow pride. Not in the weapon, not in the death it will deliver, but in the completion of a process. The shell is correct, it is whole. It has fulfilled the only expectation placed upon it. I envy that certainty. The ammunition I load will outlive me. It will be fired in battles whose names I will never hear, into enemies whose faces I will never see. It will kill efficiently, exactly as designed. It will justify the existence of this place, of this line, of the bodies consumed to keep it running. When I finally collapse, when my body is deemed non-functional and removed, the records will show that I met my quotas until the end. That my output remained within acceptable parameters. That no unnecessary inefficiency occurred. That will be enough. The machine does not mourn. The Imperium does not remember. The ammunition will be complete, and so will my erasure.